She gave the king what no other woman could: a son, an heir, a future. And just days later, she slipped away like a whisper in a grand echoing palace, like a candle blown out in the arms of joy. Her name was Jane Seymour, Queen of England, the third wife of King Henry VIII, and the only one to give him the one thing he desired most in the world: a son. But the price for life was death. Subscribe if you believe forgotten stories deserve to be remembered, because what you're about to hear isn't just about a queen. It's about every woman who risked her life just to bring another into the world. She was not like the others. No scandal, no rebellion, no war of words or thrones. Jane Seymour was gentle, modest, and soft-spoken, a lady-in-waiting who stood in the shadows of history until it was her time to rise. Born around 1508 in Wiltshire, England, Jane was the daughter of Sir John Seymour, a knight with royal connections, and Marjorie Wentworth, a woman of noble descent. She was educated at home, knew how to sew, to serve, to obey. In the Tudor court, she was considered plain in comparison to Henry's first two wives, but that was exactly what made her different. And in 1536, just days after Anne Boleyn was executed, Jane Seymour became queen. By the time Jane married him, King Henry VIII was no longer the charming young monarch of his youth. He was older, heavier, plagued by pain and politics. But more than anything, he was desperate. Desperate for a legitimate male heir. The crown had no certainty. The Tudor name had no security. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him a daughter, Mary. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, had given him another daughter, Elizabeth. But no son had survived. And in Tudor England, a woman could rule but not without fear. The future needed a prince. Jane promised to give him that. Quietly, obediently, without rebellion, ambition, or drama. Just loyalty and fertility. In early 1537, whispers filled the palace halls. Queen Jane was with child. The entire kingdom held its breath. Henry rejoiced. He praised her as a model wife, obedient, chaste, virtuous. Unlike her predecessor, for the first time in years, the court was alive with hope. Paintings of the Virgin Mary were hung. Prayers were held day and night. The astrologers watched the skies for signs. The midwives sharpened their skills. And Jane, she waited, alone, quiet, carrying not just a child but the future of England. In October 1537, Jane Seymour went into labor. The entire palace turned silent. Every footstep outside her chamber echoed like a drumbeat of fate. Every hour that passed felt heavier than the last. Her labor lasted 2 full days and nights, roughly 36 hours of unimaginable pain. No medicine, no anesthesia, no true understanding of the body's limits. She screamed into her sheets while priests prayed beyond the door. She clutched at the hands of her ladies. She bled. She cried. She endured. Until finally, on October 12, 1537, a cry broke through the chamber. A baby boy, Edward Tudor, future King Edward VI, had been born. Henry was ecstatic. He wept with pride. He thanked God. He declared it a miracle. For the first time, he had a living son. The kingdom erupted with joy. Bonfires lit the towns. Church bells rang for days. Gifts poured into the palace. Jane, pale and exhausted, was hailed as a savior of the dynasty. Henry called her his true wife. He stood beside her bed and whispered that she had done what no one else could. For a moment she had everything: the title, the praise, the love of a king, the gratitude of a kingdom. But joy has its cost. And for Jane, it was already collecting. Within hours of the birth, Jane began to fade. Some said she seemed confused. Others said her body bled too much. The court doctors argued whether it was fever or exhaustion, or a humor of the womb. But one thing was clear: Jane was dying. In Tudor times, the term was childbed fever, what we now know as puerperal sepsis, a deadly infection caused by dirty hands, contaminated cloths, or infected tools during birth. Doctors had no idea what germs were. They didn't wash hands. They reused linens. They had no antibiotics, no knowledge of sterilization. Jane grew colder, quieter, weaker. She drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she wept. By October 23, 1537, just 12 days after giving birth, Queen Jane Seymour died. Her son was not yet 2 weeks old. She was only 29 years old. Henry, devastated, locked himself away. He wore black for months. He buried her with royal honors in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, the same place where he, years later, would be laid beside her. Of all 6 of his wives, Jane was the only one to be buried with him because she gave him a son, and paid for it with her life. Jane Seymour was a queen, the most protected woman in England. She had the best physicians, the finest linens, the prayers of priests, the attention of an entire empire, and still she died alone, in a dark chamber, soaked in her own blood. If a queen couldn't survive childbirth in medieval times, what chance did a peasant girl have? If palaces couldn't protect a woman giving life, what could a village hut offer? Jane's name is remembered. She gave birth to a king. She married a king, but she died, like so many others, silenced by pain, buried by duty, and forgotten by time. This is her story, but she was not the only one. She had no crown, no kingdom, no golden cradle waiting at her bedside. She had no priests praying outside her door, no court physician watching her pulse, no husband whispering her name in fear. She was just a woman, young, trembling, with her hands pressed to her belly and a storm of pain waiting inside. And yet, her story matters, because while queens like Jane Seymour were mourned in silence and gold, the rest, the poor, the forgotten, were buried with no name at all. She was 17, married at 15 to a man twice her age, because her father owed a debt, and she was the only currency he had left. No priest asked if she loved him. No mother told her what would happen when the child grew inside her. She learned through whispers, through pain, through the stifled cries of older women who had seen it all before. When the time came, they laid her on the dirt floor of their cottage, a straw mat beneath her, a fire flickering near her knees, a bowl of boiled rags, a bucket of water already cold. No doctor, no midwife, just her mother and a neighbor, both old, both tired, both already mourning. Her screams were heard by no one but the wind outside the thatched roof. She bled, she tore. The baby was too large. There was no one to help. They gave her willow bark for the pain. It did nothing. They prayed aloud. She barely heard them. Hours passed, then a day, then two. The baby was still. The girl was colder. Her breath came shallow, and then not at all. By the third morning they wrapped her in the same rags they had prepared for the child. They buried her near the edge of the forest, under a crooked cross made of branches. No name was carved. No priest gave rites. No one remembered her birthday. She was one of thousands, thousands of young women who gave everything they had to bring life into a world that gave them nothing in return. Her chamber was large, but cold. She was highborn, married to a lord who rode off for war before the snow began to fall. He left her with a servant girl, a Bible, and the warning, deliver a son. That's your duty. The winter was cruel. Her fingers went numb even by the fire, and when her waters broke, no one knew what to do. They had sent for a midwife, but she was snowed in 2 villages away, so the servant girl did her best. The child came slowly, shoulders turned wrong. Blood ran down her thighs and soaked her silken bed. By the time the midwife arrived, the lady was quiet. The child had survived, but the mother, the one they called My Lady, was gone. Her name was recorded in one line of the estate journal, a footnote, a casualty of childbirth. They called her wise woman, others called her witch. She had delivered dozens of babies, cleaned their blood with her own skirts, caught them with calloused hands, and buried too many mothers to count. She knew herbs the church disapproved of. She whispered words when no one else would, and when a baby wouldn't breathe, she bit her own finger and dabbed the blood on its lips. But when a noble woman died under her care, they didn't ask questions. They burned her. Midwives carried life in their hands and death in their shadow. They were revered until something went wrong, and then they were monsters. In many villages, 1 in 3 women died from complications of childbirth during certain medieval periods, most of them from postpartum hemorrhage, sepsis, or obstructed labor. They weren't queens. They weren't painted on chapel walls. They weren't written about in songs, but they died all the same, sometimes giving birth to a stillborn child, sometimes clutching a living infant they would never nurse, sometimes whispering prayers with no one to hear them, and the world moved on. A woman's value in the Middle Ages was not her name, not her mind, not her spirit. It was her womb, her ability to produce heirs, especially sons. If she gave birth to daughters, she was whispered about. If she bore no children, she was called barren, cursed. If she died in childbirth, they said it was God's will. She was expected to birth children as often as possible. No rest, no recovery, no choice. And if she resisted, she was cast out, replaced, or punished. She worked in the baker's shop. She laughed with her sisters when the sun was good. She embroidered flowers onto her apron, a splash of color on her otherwise gray life. And when she married, she thought love might follow. But love never came. Only bruises, only commands. When her body swelled, she held her belly in fear, not joy. She was too thin, too tired, too alone. The child came early. No one was there, and both of them died in the same night. No one remembered the flowers on her apron. They say the soil of old Europe is rich from centuries of rain and war, but it's also rich from the blood of women, women who died giving birth in cold corners, in candlelight, in chambers filled with incense and no hope. Some were queens, some were daughters, some were lovers, servants, or strangers, but they all carried life and died for it, and no one carved their stories into stone. That's what they said, but she was just a woman. As if being a woman wasn't already an act of defiance in a world built to silence her. She didn't choose to bleed. She didn't ask for pain. She never got to decide if she wanted to be a mother, only told she had to be. And when she died, the world didn't stop, the sky didn't darken, the men didn't pause. Life went on, and her name was swept into the dust. You've heard the Queen's story. You've followed the forgotten women into the silence. But now, we go deeper into the dark truth of childbirth in the Middle Ages, where every cry, every breath, and every drop of blood was part of a cruel ritual called motherhood. There were no painkillers, no hospitals, no understanding of infection. Doctors didn't wash their hands. Midwives used cloths they couldn't clean. Every birth was a gamble. Bleeding, they let it happen. Infections, they didn't even know they existed. The church said, Eve sinned. All women must suffer. Pain wasn't a tragedy. It was a holy punishment. If you died in childbirth, they called it God's will. Not a failure. Not a loss. Just fate. Noble. Women gave birth in lying-in chambers. Dark, windowless, thick with incense. Fresh air was feared. Light was shut out. Only women were allowed inside. And there, in the dark, a woman screamed into her sheets while candles melted quietly. Nearby, hooks, knives, bare hands. Midwives had no gloves, no stitches, no anesthesia. They worked by instinct and prayer. When things went wrong, they had no way to stop the bleeding, and often they bled with their patients on their hands, their skirts, their memories. The most common killer, not the pain, not the labor, but infection. Childbed fever, what we now call sepsis, crept in silently after birth. From dirty linens, from hands that touched too much, fever would rise, skin would go cold, and a young mother would be gone within days. Even queens, like Jane Seymour, who died just 12 days after giving birth to Edward VI. Despite royal care, clean sheets, and prayers, she couldn't be saved. Jane had everything, yet she died in silence. Imagine the peasant girl birthing alone in a hut, the servant girl with no one to clean her, the wife who bled quietly so she wouldn't disturb her master. They had no names in records, no graves with flowers, just whispers and dirt. They believed the womb moved inside the body. That craving fruit would mark the baby. That sadness poisoned the child. And that sons mattered more than daughters. A woman who bore only girls was shamed. A woman who bore none was called cursed. A woman who died in childbirth was quickly replaced. Stillbirth was common, infant death even more so. And if the baby died before baptism, they believed its soul would be lost. So mothers raced to baptize dying newborns. Between contractions, between tears, between life and death. When the child was born still, they buried it at night. No prayers, no ceremony, just shame, and the mother. She buried her grief with her child, silently, alone. To be strong meant to suffer without sound, to bleed without complaint, to die without resistance. Women were praised for their endurance, not their survival. Their pain was expected. Their death was accepted. But here's the truth. They were not weak. They were not cursed. They were brave. They carried life knowing it might cost them everything, and they did it anyway. For sons, for survival, for love, even if the world didn't return it. Every time a baby was born, a woman stood at the edge of death. Sometimes she came back, sometimes she didn't. Some wore crowns, some wore rags, but all of them, queens, servants, midwives, girls, faced the same war, in the same room, with the same silence. If Jane Seymour, a queen, died bringing a king into this world, how many others were lost without a name? Subscribe, if you believe their stories must be told. Share, if you believe their pain deserves a voice, because they didn't die for nothing. They died giving life, and that should never be forgotten.